Değerli konuklar, şimdi de oturumumuzun son konuşmacısını sizlere takdim etmek istiyorum. Ekosistem konusuna yer vereceğiz. Takdimini kendinin ana dili olan İngilizce'de yapmak isterim izninizle. Herb Simmens has been a city and country manager, professor of urban planning and head of long-range planning for the state of New Jersey. He also was a private planning consultant and led a non-profit focused on sustainability and climate. He is the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, the first book that attempts to create a vocabulary for the post-normal world of climate change. By skillfully explaining more than 400 words and phrases with humor and clarity, A Climate Vocabulary of the Future provides readers with the information they need to both understand and also act. Please welcome Professor, author, planner and impact investor Herb Simmens for his inspiring presentation with the title, The Three Essential Steps Needed to Restore a Safe Climate for Everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure and honor to be with you today, this morning in Washington, D.C., and I understand late afternoon in Turkey. This is the second time I've been invited to speak here. I had the privilege to speak here last year on this day, and I'm delighted and happy that you decided to invite me back to speak again this year. Last year, I presented a whole series of slides with all sorts of information, like many of your other presenters. But I've decided for today, I just simply want to speak directly to you with my words and nothing more than my words. Because, and I realize I understand I'm the last speaker today, and I want to leave you, as speakers often try to do, with some hope and some optimism, as many of your other speakers have done so today. But I think it's no surprise that we are in a series of what might be called multi-crises in the world today. Many things happening at the same time, large forces, many of which we've never seen before, particularly those revolving around the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, that we have these dual, overlapping, interconnected, extremely complex, extremely difficult to understand, and even more difficult to act on effectively situations in the world where we are essentially destroying the source of our lives, the sustenance of our lives, and that of virtually every other living creature on the planet Earth. And we've known this for many decades now. And yet we, when I say we, the world community, have continued to make the problem worse each and every year, relentlessly, systematically, and without much relief, unfortunately, despite literally billions, many billions of dollars, even trillions of dollars of investment, hundreds of conferences and meetings all over the world with world leaders and citizens and activists flying here and flying there, and engaged in heated discussions and negotiations, and at their local council and their communities to the world stage, and nothing has worked. And I think part of the reason for that, and this is what I want to focus on this morning for just a few minutes, is that at least with regard to climate, the paradigm, the model, the approach has been what I have called ERA, or emission reductions alone. The almost sole focus on this almost religious, passionate need to reduce what we emit in the way of CO2. And I will be the last person to say that that is not necessary or unimportant or even essential. However, it's only 1/3 of the story. There's 2/3 of more, as well as even other dimensions that I don't have time to get into today. There's also a need, and we again, the world community, I believe, has the knowledge and the resources, and what knowledge and resources we don't have, we can develop quite quickly to not only reduce the carbon dioxide and the methane and all the other smaller gases and the nitrous oxides and so forth that warm and heat now, heat is a more accurate word than warm, but also we have the ability and the need to remove what we have accumulated in the atmosphere, the legacy, you might say, or the historic emissions, because when you think about it, that's what's really causing the crisis, not what we emit today. If we stopped emitting today, temperatures wouldn't dramatically come down. They might come down a tiny little bit, but it's the accumulated blanket. Essentially, each year we thicken a blanket above our heads in the atmosphere, but because of the nature of these greenhouse gases, warming us and heating us and heating us, the thicker the blanket gets. So, and yet, if you look at the world community and what we've talked about, we don't talk about the blanket. When we do, we also talk about the need to not make the blanket thicker, rather than to pull the damn blanket away from us, so we can be cool. Just as on a hot night, we want to take the blanket away from us so we can cool off. But the third dimension of this, and one I think that's gotten the least attention and is the most controversial by far, is the fact that many of us, still a very small minority of people, have begun to see, based upon what we've seen in the Arctic with the melting of Arctic ice, and other parts of the planet, where we have what are called tipping points, where we're basically reaching the point where we're almost out of control of the climate, where it's becoming so self-reinforcing, whether it's the Amazon burning up and releasing carbon dioxide from the soils, or the Arctic ice melting, thus leading to darker areas where the sea is, and this darker area absorbs more CO2, thus making it darker yet, which absorbs more CO2, this self-perpetuating crisis. And there's no study in the world that has demonstrated that even if we're able to dramatically speed up how quickly we reduce emissions, that we'll be able to stop in time the melting of the ice. There was one study that came out just 3 years ago that said once all the summer ice melts, and that could be, and is projected to be sometime this century, most likely in the first half of the century, that it will release as much heat because of the physics as 25 years of carbon dioxide and other emissions on the whole planet. Essentially, we'll be speeding up our destiny with doom, if you want to call it that, by 25 years, and will just dwarf all of our smaller efforts to reduce emissions. So it is truly an emergency in the most pure meaning of that term. And there are approaches, however, that can slow down, if not reverse, this melting of the ice. But what they require is large-scale physical interventions, either in the Arctic or in areas around that. And I'll just mention a couple of them in a minute. But my larger message is that we need to put together a plan, a world plan, and the world has never come together in quite this way. It has come together before to fight disease, to fight the ozone layer. So there are models for how the world can work together. We need a plan to do what I've called the climate triad being 3. Emission reductions, I'm not suggesting we stop that. In fact, if anything, we need to accelerate that. Large scale withdrawal or drawdown of CO2 and methane from the atmosphere. And thirdly, directly cool, the way we would put a fan on you or ourselves on a hot summer night, or air conditioning, if we're fortunate enough to have it, directly cool the planet through what are largely sort of artificial means, but are based upon natural principles. And in my view, in the view of many scientists and others that I've begun to work with, including some here, perhaps even on this call, we are confident that a program that incorporates those three elements in a careful plan, but with large emergency urgent action quickly. We don't have 5 years, we don't have 10 years to wait. We can not only slow down climate change, we can actually reverse it and restore a safe climate. Now, if you haven't heard this before and you follow climate, you probably think, why is this guy telling us this? Who is he to say what the world climate scientists are not saying and the world leaders are not saying? I don't have the time to explain at least my theory on why that might be the case, why this is not being heard from in a serious tone from our world leaders and our scientists and our climate activists. But all I'm saying to you is I urge you to look more closely at what I'm suggesting today. And I certainly welcome you to contact me. My email address is simply my first initial H and my last name, which I think you have there, Simmens, SIMMENS @gmail.com. I'd be happy to send you more information about it. But I mean, that's basically the message I want to get across to you today. And let me give you another analogy, and that is the bathtub analogy. If we think about a bathroom where the bathtub is overflowing because the spigot where the water is coming is sending out water so fast, faster than it was ever designed for. And the bathtub itself, which is filled up with water, which, let's say this water, like CO2, is healthy for us in small quantities, but dangerous in large quantities. So we have a bathtub that's overflowing. We have a spigot that's spewing out this water, and we have the floor of the bathtub that is starting to flood, so that it's beginning to weaken and possibly even damage the building. Well, what I'm saying is that we need to focus our repair crew, which is all of us, on all three of those things: on stopping and closing the spigot, on taking the plug out of the bathtub so that the water can drain, and mopping up and cleaning the floor so that our whole house doesn't collapse. And yet the world community is focused almost entirely on simply working as hard as we can to turn off their spigot. And in 30 years, they haven't succeeded. There's even more water coming out now. So that's another analogy that I use that I think some people have found helpful in doing this. Now, you might ask, what are some of the techniques that can do this? Well, for the removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you may have heard there are what's called direct air capture. There's actually large machines that are being built now in several countries around the world, in Switzerland, in Iceland, in Canada, and other places, that can literally, with large fans, basically pull out the CO2 in the atmosphere and find places to either use it, either bury it, or actually incorporate it into materials. And you can make things out of that CO2, or you can even use it in your soft drinks. That's where the bubbles come when you're drinking your Pepsi or your Coca-Cola. So, but there are also natural means, massively increasing the number of trees we put out there in the world, increasing the marshes along the coastline. And I've read in Turkey, a lot of marshes have been destroyed over the years for development purposes, and that's true all over the world. So by restoring those marshes, and we know how to do that, they're so productive biologically, they can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. I don't have time to go into a lot of the other techniques, but they exist, but they're small scale. They need much more research. They need much more attention. They need much more government money. And this effort, when you speak about money, these things that I'm talking about, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and basically doing the kind of engineering to cool the planet are essentially they're equal to what we spend to make our country safer, our defense budgets. Think of this as simply in addition to our defense budget, defending ourselves against our own oblivion, actually. It's as simple as that. And yet governments put up massive billions of dollars for defense. And of course, this week we see why that's important. But put up almost no money to defend ourselves from an even bigger threat. It's really kind of irrational, quite honestly, and very disturbing, but nonetheless, absolutely true. But then you say, well, how can we stop the ice from melting? Well, there's some very creative scientists and engineers that have been thinking about that problem for years now, and I've gotten to know some of them. There's one man from a professor at Edinburgh University in the United Kingdom who's come up with a technique in doing the engineering to have specially designed ships that would sail in parts of the country or parts of the world that had extreme weather or in the Arctic where the ice was melting. And literally these ships would blow out of their top of the ship, if you will, out of their smokestack. Instead of smoke, they would blow out very finely calibrated and designed salt particles, plain old salt. And it would have an impact on the clouds such that it would brighten the clouds and cool off the planet because it would allow more heat to escape to the outer atmosphere or so. There are other similar techniques you may have heard about where you have planes going in the air and basically trying to mimic what happened when Mount Pinatubo, which was the volcano that erupted in Indonesia in 1990, I think 1991. And that volcano was so powerful that it cooled the temperature on the entire planet for over a year by 1 degree Celsius, for an entire year from one planetary volcanic eruption or so. So imagine if we had more controlled, smaller eruptions that we did on our own through airplanes or other techniques, that we could stop at any time if it looked like it wasn't working or it was working too much. And it would cost a tiny bit of probably 1 day's worth of the war that we're witnessing, the tragic war not far from your own country here. So there are lots of other techniques that they're very promising, but most environmental groups, I don't know if that's true in Turkey, but it's certainly true in the United States and in Europe. Most environmental groups are so afraid both of the potential negative consequences of these techniques, but what they're also afraid of even more is what they call the moral hazard, the fear that if we focus on them, that will give us all a license to continue emitting. And so therefore, if we do that, people will stop taking climate seriously because they'll think, oh, well, they're taking care of it. So basically, year after year, we're getting worse and worse. We're getting to the point where we're in such danger. And some of you may have read, hopefully many of you did, the stories about the IPCC report on vulnerability and impacts that came out just 24 hours ago. And it painted the most grim picture if we continue on our present pathway. So what we're saying is we have to do this. We don't have a choice, and we need to educate the world community on the need that we also have to continue reducing emissions, and we need to do both. We don't have a choice. We can't say, let's not do one because it might interfere with people's psychology and doing a second. But this is what we're coming across, those of us who are attempting to get this to happen, some of the obstacles that are standing in our way, where we really need help. We need your help. I don't expect you, if you haven't heard this before, to believe what I'm saying today. All I expect and ask is that you'll look at it further. You'll see if what I'm saying makes any bit of sense. Maybe you'll search online for carbon dioxide removal or polar ice removal or geoengineering or things like that, begin to learn about these techniques, begin to the degree to which you become convinced that they're worth looking at, talk to your legislators here, talk to your friends and colleagues in other countries. I'm sure many of you, by virtue of the kind of audience that would be here today, have friends and colleagues and contacts at businesses and institutions and governments and universities all around the world. I think I will close by saying something that, or repeating something that a man by the name of Sir David King, who was the science advisor to several British prime ministers, not the current one, for many years, and is a distinguished professor at Cambridge, and is working on just the kinds of things I'm talking about. He basically, I heard him say 2 years ago when I was in London, he said, we, the people living here today on this planet, have 10 years to affect what will happen in the next 10,000. What we choose to do or not do in the next 10 years will affect 10,000 years. And that's, except for the catastrophe of nuclear war, which unfortunately we may be a little closer to, but that's another story. Human beings have never had that ability and power, as scary as that is. But what I want to say, though, is just in the 3 years since I've heard him say that, recently I happened to watch a talk he gave to the Brazilian parliament, and he also speaks to other groups around the world. And this time, he didn't have a more optimistic message. Guess what his message was? His message is, well, we have 3 to 5 years to put into place the kinds of things I'm talking about that will help preserve or restore a safe climate. And if we don't act in a worldwide, coordinated, emergency way on these 3 dimensions, in the next 3 to 5 years, it'll essentially be too late. And I don't have the time, and I don't have the heart to even describe what too late means. But I think each of you watching this today know yourself what too late means. And you want, and I want, and we all want to be able to have many, many future days like this day that you're having today that have optimistic presentations on how we can continue to increase welfare in the world and public health and prosperity and peace and all the things that mean so much to us. And the last thing we want is to even begin to struggle to even have a day like this, because we live in a world that is so decayed and so dangerous and so difficult to navigate, that we're focusing on our basic survival, on our shelter and our food. Not that that isn't true for many billions of people today. I don't want to minimize that. But I don't want to, it's always difficult to sort of draw the line between being, too apocalyptic, too dour, and also to be unrealistically hopeful. But my basic message is not one of hope by any means. What it is, though, is one of a increasingly narrow path, a path that gets tinier and tinier, that's alongside the cliff. And the further we go, the more difficult it is to walk each and every step without falling off to get to the other side. And that's where we are now. That cliff pathway is narrowing and narrowing. And I urge you and ask you and request you today to take a look at what I've suggested as one, in fact, the only one that I know of, the only pathway to deal at least with the climate cliff. Obviously, there are other cliffs. There's the collapse of ecology and birds and fish and everything else, some of which, a lot of which is connected to climate. But at least the fundamental cliff of having a safe climate for all of us to live in and on and around is one that we have taken for granted for all of human history, and we no longer can take that for granted. There is a way out. Again, I'm repeating myself, not because I'm looking for a reason to stay on for another couple minutes, but because I can't not repeat myself when I try to stress literally the existential urgency, if not emergency, of finding a pathway as the one I've outlined today in the broadest, most general terms. I realize I haven't had time to go into any of the details, and I'd be happy to do so in some other forum. But it's one that we think by the middle of the century, we now have about 1.2 degrees centigrade temperatures higher than the pre-industrial era. We think by the middle of the century or a little later, we can get that increase in temperature instead of going up, which all the IPCC reports say it's just going to go up and up and up no matter what we do, to 1.5 and 2 and even beyond that in all likelihood. We think we can get it to start going down so that in 2040 or 2050, the world temperature increase might be less than 1 degree Celsius rather than 1.2 now. That we can cool the planet, we can restore life, we can restore health, we can restore optimism for the future and a better life for everyone here in Turkey and everywhere else on the planet. So with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today, to give you my message. I hope and pray that at least some of you will take what I've said to heart. I don't expect you to do it without challenging the message, as you should, or challenging me, the messenger, either one. But I look forward to hearing what you've done or will do in following up for this very important and wonderful future day that you have every year. Again, it's been my great honor and privilege to be able to speak with you for a half hour today. And I wish you all good luck and health, success, and a positive future for your country and the rest of us. Thank you very much.
Dear Herb, first of all, thank you very much for your being with us today in the Future Day. We have two questions coming from our audience. The first one is, you talked about a plan in which the whole world should act together and the time is running out. What do you think, who plays the most important role in this act or in this union?
Boy, that's a difficult question. And it's one that the climate group that I've been working on, it's called the Healthy Planet Action Coalition, has been spending a lot of time focusing on. Should it be the G20 countries? Should it be the United Nations? Should it be an independent coalition of countries? Should it be civic society, civil society? It really has to be all of us. And that's part of the challenge is we almost have to sort of invent a new set of procedures and institutions to make decisions on this work. And, quite honestly, if I was giving this talk a month ago, I certainly wouldn't be optimistic, but I might be more optimistic because there are 6 countries that basically border the Arctic and they have an Arctic Council. And so I might say, let's get these 6 countries to agree. But unfortunately, one of the countries is the one that has the largest Arctic exposure. I don't think I need to mention the name of the country, except to say they're the same country that's sitting in the Ukraine. What are the chances that they will agree with the other 5 countries now on a peaceful effort like this? So, I'm not an expert on how we enable this. I think what I'm trying to do and what my colleagues are trying to do is at least get the awareness and the hope that one, junior government minister somewhere or a head of a climate group or, maybe even a Turkish billionaire will hear this and say, I want to take some action and I'm going to make some calls. So I don't have a formula for you today, but there are lots of potential opportunities if people realize that there is a way to do this and we need to do it urgently.
Great, thank you. One last question. I mean, you touched upon the topic, but maybe you will share a different perspective. Scientists, academicians, and many more warned the world about the climate change, and you also mentioned about the cliff. In your opinion, why has little to no steps have been taken and not something is happening on a larger scale?
Well, I think that there's, I guess, two answers. The first answer has to do with the fact that climate is an extraordinarily difficult issue to address or problem to solve, if that's even the right word, whatever the approach may be, because all 7+ billion of us on the earth are some part of the problem. And everything we do every day, probably 10 or 20 or 30 times a day, each one of us directly or indirectly burns CO2, right? I am by, talking to you on this laptop today. It's a lot less than if I had, flown over on Turkish Air, but it's still something. So, it's an incredibly difficult problem to stop anyway. And fossil fuels are like magic. I mean, we take them for granted, but imagine you pour a couple liters of this liquid into this vehicle, and basically this multi-$1,000 vehicle or 1,000-pound vehicle, all you have to do is touch your foot on the accelerator and it will go, 100 kilometers an hour. It's magic. So how do we give up something like that very easily? It's not easy to do. But the larger question of why we're not focusing on these other two things, I don't have a real great answer for that. I think partly because reducing emissions seems like the most direct thing to do, and because when we first started focusing on this years ago, we had very little idea of any knowledge of how to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it back in the ground or in products. So, but we knew that, if we stopped driving or use wind instead of solar, we'd put up less CO2 into the atmosphere. And in terms of the cooling, I think there's, as I mentioned, a number of reasons there. There's a lot of people in the world today, I found particularly a lot of environmental groups, that are really afraid of technology. They don't trust it. They don't trust the people who handle it, and maybe for good reason. And this would be a technological approach, that wouldn't be everyday people doing this, but maybe the military or special teams that would be doing this, and people are nervous about it. They're also nervous because they've seen how many mistakes the world has made with other technologies in the past that haven't worked out well. And so they're saying, we can make it even worse. Let's not take that risk. So there's lots of reasons. And we're at the point, unfortunately, I call it the sort of the age of triage. Triage being making very, very difficult trade-offs between one bad thing and another bad thing. In an emergency room, deciding which person is hurt worse, so the doctor would see that person worse. And nobody likes to think we're in an age of triage, but that's what we are. So therefore, geoengineering and cooling is not the greatest thing to think about, but it's probably the least worst thing. So those are, in just 2 or 3 minutes, a couple of reasons. But, it's an extremely important question. Both questions are, and they deserve a much more extended discussion.
Dear Herb, first of all, thank you very much for your valuable insights and also the sincere answers for the challenging questions. I hope we talk too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.